Khealos' Gaming Table. I'm Khealos, and on this channel I talk about tabletop RPGs, miniature war games, and the continued rambles here in Orlando, talking about whatever comes to mind. Yesterday I talked about Dungeons & Dragons and my history with it. Today we're going to swing back to a science fiction franchise, something that I grew up with when I lived in England. You know, broken record, I know. But we're going to be talking about Battlestar Galactica. Battlestar Galactica was a TV show from the 1970s, post-Star Wars. The premise of the story was the 12 colonies of man were at war with the Cylon Empire. Cylons being a robotic, cybernetic species, and they've been at war after the Cylons tried to enslave or attack an ally of these colonies, and the colonies, rose up to defend them, and well, they've been in a intergalactic war ever since. A man by the name of Count Baltar, negotiates a peace treaty or a ceasefire, between the two forces, and the idea to get an armistice signed and end the war. The Battlestars all grouped together, as military formations are wont to do, so that they can be easily attacked in one place and not be out to defend the rest of their forces, the planets or whatever they're supposed to be defending. Everyone except for Commander Adama of the Battlestar Galactica, roll credits, wanted to believe that this was going to be the end of the war and they could move on with their lives. He, however, was skeptical, so he kept his particular Battlestar on alert, and once they figured out that a wave of fighters were approaching, he launched all of his Colonial Vipers, their space superiority fighters, to defend them. None of the other Battlestars managed to deploy any of their fighters, and consequently all were wiped out except for the Galactica. The 12 colonies of man were effectively annihilated, and Commander Adama went down, gathered up any survivors that he could, packed them into any ships that would fly, and they fled the colonies. The idea being that, they would pick up and, try and relocate somewhere else away from the Cylon Empire. According to the scriptures, there was a lost 13th colony, the colony of Earth, and that's where they wanted to go. Basically, because the hope was that this 13th colony would be more advanced and be able to protect them, but if nothing else, it'll give them a new home to start from. Now, originally the show was going to be a series of telemovies, released once a year, once every couple of years, continuing the saga, the story of the Battlestar Galactica, that would give the writers time to actually write good stories, that would give the visual effects teams time to get new effects put together, new costumes, the whole thing, because science fiction is not cheap to produce, especially in the 1970s when you had nothing but really practical effects. John Dykstra of ILM fame had been brought on to do a lot of the visual effects for the show, and looking at it, very reminiscent of what he had helped do with Star Wars, to the point that Lucasfilm actually sued them, for being too close to the visual effects that Star Wars had done. Lucasfilm did lose, but that's still there. Originally, the pilot, if you will, was called The Saga of a Star World, and it established the premise of the story. The main characters: Commander Adama, played by the late Lorne Greene; Captain Apollo, played by the late Richard Hatch; Lieutenant Starbuck, played by Dirk Benedict; Lieutenant Boomer, played by Herb Jefferson Jr., Colonel Ty, played by Terry Carter, and there are, others. So they put out a Saga of Star World. Like the first episode was the attack by the Cylons, and, you know, them fleeing the colonies. The second episode was them looking for a place of refuge, and they settled on a planet called Khealos, a place where they could get Tylium to help refuel their fleet, and they were hoping that the citizens of Khealos were not allied with the Cylons, so they have a arduous trek there. And finally, you know, the final part of the story was them finding out, well, spoiler alert, Khealos was not friendly. In fact, they were allied with the Cylons, and basically attempted to betray them, and, you know, the humans obviously escaped and moved on. The executives at ABC, I'm pretty sure it was ABC, basically saw the ratings bonanza as everyone was clamoring for something new sci-fi wise, especially in the wake of Star Wars. And as opposed to continuing with the idea of it being telemovies, they decided to move it to full production for a TV show. The only problem being they wanted it the same quality, the same everything to keep the ratings up, but they wanted it done cheaper because, you know, executives are leeches and parasites, and they have no idea how to make anything work. They just, you know, tell people. The problem was nobody was really prepared, so they had to get actual, you know, fresh script writers to come in and start writing stories. They had some ideas, and the first several quote-unquote episodes or story arcs actually were fairly well fleshed out. You had where they actually found what they thought was the lost planet of Kobol, where humanity supposedly came from. And then you had Gun on Ice Planet Zero, which is another multi-part story where the Galactica and her fleet are flying through space only to be boxed in by an approaching Cylon fleet behind them, and a planet that has a super laser that could, you know, destroy every ship that comes through. You know, you're not watching Battlestar Galactica for scientific accuracy or anything like that, you know, for the same reason you're not watching Star Wars for scientific accuracy or physics in space or, you know, anything realistic. Ignoring all of that, it was actually, you know, very, for me, very good stories. I enjoyed them as a kid. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of these I didn't see in episode format. The company had taken a bunch of the two-parter episodes and clipped out, edited some of it, and put it into basically a 2-hour movie. So a lot of these I didn't actually see in full episode format until I got back to the States. Well, the quality of the show obviously dropped. Visual effects being very expensive, especially when you're doing practical models. One of the first things that you'll notice, even going back to Saga of a Star World, is they recycle some of the shots. Whether it's the Vipers launching, the Vipers landing, formations of Cylon fighters, whether they flip the film so that they're approaching from the left instead of the right, or they're banking and turning to the left and then they're banking and turning to the right, different combat shots, you know, whatever the case is, you know, very cool the first time, but when you watch it the second time, you suddenly start picking out those things, and that definitely detracted from the show. The writing, as the series progressed, also decreased, you know, because the costume department had to come up with interesting costumes that didn't look modern, but, you know, tried to fit with that aesthetic. The episode where they played, I forget what the sport was, but effectively it was like a two-person basketball, and they wore very skimpy uniforms, costumes, whatever. It's pretty bad. You know, again, some of the episodes were really well done, some of them not so much. And over the years, you know, the original Battlestar Galactica has been chalked up to campy sci-fi. One of the big things, and I can certainly appreciate that, is this. Battlestar Galactica is about the aftermath of the virtual annihilation of the human race. You know, like some 220 ships packed full like sardines of people escaping from 12 planets. And yet the show was extremely optimistic, family-oriented. There was the brief chimpanzee in a dog costume that they used for a robotic Daggett that got phased out. But, you know, they tried a bunch of different things, but ultimately the show was canceled. Sure enough, executives wanting to recapture the magic, the ratings, the money that at least the first initial episodes of Battlestar Galactica generated, they came up with a continuation story called Galactica 1980. And in this particular story, this is set, years after the last episode of Battlestar Galactica, the Galactica has finally reached Earth. The problem being, Earth is 1980, not the advanced technological society that they were hoping for. Sure, the planet has plenty of room for them, but at the same time, if the Cylons do ever find them, there's no way to protect the planet. Earth couldn't defend itself. It's still fighting amongst itself, let alone, trying to defend itself from an alien threat like the Cylons. So the premise was for them to then land on the planet, hook up with different scientists and things like that, and start introducing new technology to help bring Earth, advance it along so that it could eventually defend itself. There was a lot of social commentary. I don't remember much about Galactica 1980. I do remember the motorcycles, which I thought were pretty cool. They were given some motorcycles and they could fly. That was pretty cool. At least, to like an 8-year-old. Pretty cool if you're an adult as well, especially if you like motorcycles. But the show lasted like half a season. The best episode out of it was the final one. So I believe Terry Carter remained on the show. You still had Commander Adama, and the leader of the Force, the leader of the Galactica and the surviving fleet. But there were the other cast like Dirk Benedict, Richard Hatch, Herb Jefferson. No, Herb was still with them because he was, I think, now Captain Boomer. But they weren't there. I don't think they actually explained what happened. In one of the novels, Apollo had been killed, but read into that what you will. The final episode was The Return of Starbuck, and it was kind of technically a flashback episode. In Galactica 1980, there is a scientific genius, a boy, the Wunderkind, named Dr. Z. And he basically is a scientific genius and all of this. Well, in the episode of Return of Starbuck, it's a flashback. Starbuck has crash landed after a fight with the Cylons, and there's a Cylon raider that also crash landed. Starbuck being I don't know what you would call him. He got lonely, so he went over and inspected it, and there were 3 Cylon warriors, and after some kajiggering, he managed to reactivate one of them, but set up a kill switch so that if the Cylon attempted to kill him or rebel or whatever, he could turn it off. Well, they have an uneasy alliance at first, and eventually sort of become friends. Kind of an enemy mine type situation. 2 enemies, mortal enemies, forced to work together in order to survive. Well, along the way, somehow they find a young woman who is very pregnant, and they help build a ship with the wreckage of the Colonial Viper and the Cylon Raider, and in a very Moses-esque fashion, or Kal-El, Superman, however you want to look at it, they're able to create a starship, load the child into it, and launch him into space. We'll come to find out that's the Dr. Z character. There's a final battle as some Cylon Raider lands, and 3 Cylon Centurions disembark. Psi, the Cylon that Starbuck repairs, is destroyed, but they managed to destroy the other 3, and that's the last we ever saw of Starbuck. I'm sure that there would have been plans to bring, some of the other characters or other things forward, but ratings-wise, the show tanked. I mean, it was just abysmal. And then that was it. Galactica in 1980 was done, and that was it for Battlestar Galactica. Marvel Comics did comic run. There were a series of novels based upon the various screenplays. Robert Thurston, I believe, wrote them. Similar to what they did with a bunch of the Star Trek novels. They took the scripts, adapted them to a novel, and put them out. Subtle differences here and there, but that was it. Richard Hatch tried to relaunch Battlestar Galactica with, effectively Battlestar Galactica: The Next Generation. He put out a massive mortgage on his house to generate a teaser trailer, where effectively, 20 years after the end of the original Battlestar Galactica, completely bypassing and ignoring Galactica 1980. The Galactica is still, leading the fleet, fleeing, attempting to find Earth. The Cylons have obviously, been upgraded, still hunting them. We get to see, I think, John Colicos's as Baltar, one of his final performances, if not his final performance. And he shopped this around trying to get interest. It was a big fan draw at various, Comic Cons and places like that, but nobody ever signed up for it. Nobody bought the rights, and it just kind of languished. He did write or ghostwrite or have ghostwritten a series of novels, based upon that premise that he was trying to shop around to the various studios to, get Battlestar Galactica relaunched. The novels in and of themselves weren't terribly bad. They gave a lot more to Captain Apollo, later Commander Apollo, obviously, because a little bit of self-insertion in there, but the novels themselves weren't particularly edited well. There were a lot of different mistakes. I enjoyed them for the most part, but when the last novel was released and there was nothing picked up about it, that was it. Glenn Larson wanted to try and redo some Battlestar Galactica stuff, although I think he only had the movie rights, or maybe it was the rights to the character Commander Kane and the Pegasus, another Battlestar that had survived the Holocaust, the colonial Holocaust. There was lots of talks about that, lots of interest generated, or attempted to generate interest, but that never took off. And again, that languished, and Battlestar Galactica, just kind of faded into that 70s camp obscurity sci-fi. Fans of the show, would watch it and talk about it, but, it would show up on Best Of or History of Sci-Fi or, whatever the case is. The Sci-Fi Channel would broadcast it, not necessarily always in order, but, if you're a big fan, you can still watch it. In the early 2000s, Ronald D. Moore of Star Trek: The Next Generation fame, he was one of the big writers for TNG, pitched a reboot of Battlestar Galactica. And a lot of the setup is very similar. There's 12 colonies of man, there's a huge war between the Cylons. But instead of the Cylons being an enemy outside of the colonies, the Cylons were actually created by the colonies. Somehow they became self-aware and decided to rebel and rise up and start a massive war against the colonies. We're going for a longer walk this morning because it's Saturday morning. It'll give me a longer chance to ramble. So the pilot for this, or the 3-episode telemovies, whatever you want to call it, sets up the series. It's set in a more modern and kind of more futuristic style. The colonies are highly technological. They've got space travel between everything. The ships are more the ships have that similar or the same aesthetic, but they're more modernized, as opposed to the kind of weird looking flight suits that they had on the original Battlestar Galactica. They looked more like something you would see on a modern Air Force, you know, actual pressure suits, helmets that sealed, you know, that kind of thing. And the war raged for like 20 or 30 years, maybe longer. And then an armistice was signed, and in the middle of the barrier between human... All right, we're going to pause here. All right, we're moving away from the traffic, so go ahead and pick this back up. So the setup was, humans had built the Cylons. Cylons got self-aware. Cylons rebelled, you know, because they were effectively an enslaved race. And, you know, there's one thing that history and science fiction has taught us, and fantasy for that matter: enslaved races typically do not stay enslaved and usually come back with a vengeance. The Cylons waged a massive war. Ultimately, the war ended in an armistice, a cessation of hostilities, and in between colonial and Cylon space, there was an armistice station. Okay, we're going to pause here. All right, so in between Cylon and colonial space, they set up an armistice station where the cessation of hostilities, the armistice, was actually signed. And then, as far as anyone else was concerned, the Cylons vanished, never to be seen again. Every year, an envoy is sent to the armistice station on the anniversary of the signing of the armistice, waiting, you know, to try and, you know, see what the Cylons were up to, figure out what's going on, so on and so forth. And for like 20 years, no one ever shows up. You know, that representative shows up for a day, hangs out, reads a book, has lunch, gets up, leaves. Humanity, the colonies, progresses technology, advance past the Cylon War, and, you know, continue with their lives, not expecting anything else to happen. The Cylons have been gone for 20 years. Everyone's fat, dumb, and happy. Technology has progressed. Society has advanced. And everyone's happy. Come to find out, the Cylons have worked on evolving themselves, as opposed to looking like the giant robotic war machines that they had. You know, big chrome toaster. They call them toasters, but they're big and they're silver. They've got claws for hands, guns built into their arms. They're just generally nasty. The Cylons actually worked to evolve themselves and actually create humanoid forms that will blend in with humans down to like a cellular level. You know, they've got blood, they've got all the systems inside that a human does: nervous system, endocrine, cardiopulmonary, whatever the case is, so that they can absolutely blend in with people. One of the things that they had been working with was with a scientist by the name of Gaius Baltar. Roll, you know, name recognition right there, who had been working with like the Ministry of Defense and coming up with, you know, software packages for the various warships and things like that. Well, what the Cylons did is they seduced him. He didn't know it. He gave access to some of his files to a beautiful Cylon woman played by the extremely attractive Tricia Helfer, and she inserted some code into there. That code being uploaded to all modern warships and fighters. And at effectively their own D-Day, the Cylons started their attack. They started dropping nuclear weapons on the various colonies, and that was absolutely terrifying to see, because, you know, we've talked about the possibility of nuclear strikes. You know, we saw a little bit of that in Terminator 2, but the technology, you know, for visual effects had advanced to the point that you really can see like the mushroom clouds, the explosions, the everything from both orbit and on the planet. And as somebody that did grow up at the tail end of the Cold War, watching worried about the threat of a nuclear annihilation, that definitely struck a chord. Well, the Battlestar Galactica, well, what happened was all of the warships, all the additional all the newer battle stars, all of their Vipers that had been updated with this particular software package. Well, the Cylons, when they appeared, sent out a signal, a pulse, that effectively disabled them, allowing them to be cleaned out without any sort of problems. Well, Commander Adama, being the paranoid bastard that he was, he was commander of the Galactica. It was fixing to be decommissioned and turned into a floating museum, a relic of the colonial Cylon War. He was also fixing to retire. So and he just had a complement of the old school Vipers that hadn't been updated with these software packages. So when the war commenced, his ships were not as effective as everyone else. And some of the drama in that was the colonial government system was very similar to that of the United States. You had a president, chambers of Congress or whatever, but there's also a distinct chain of command. Well, come to find out, after the president and everyone down the line, the equivalent of the Secretary of Education finds out, Laura Roslin, she's the most senior surviving member of the cabinet, and she gets sworn in as president. And there's a lot of friction between her and Commander Adama, because Commander Adama is a soldier. He doesn't want to believe that this woman who 24 hours ago was a just the Secretary of Education is now the president and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And he wants to take the war to the Cylons. Rosalind points out that the war is over. They've lost. And if they want to survive, they're going to have to flee and start making babies. And that's pretty much exactly what she tells him. Because without, new children, if they try and stay and fight, they're going to become extinct. And there's a bunch, very similar to the setup in the classic Battlestar Galactica, in that they start rounding up as many people as they can in ships. And any ships that are FTL capable, unlike the original where they just had a generic speed and sometimes went to light speed, they actually have jump drives to allow them to jump from location to location. And the series after that is, basically them, us following the survivors of the Holocaust, and also at the flip side, watching things from the Cylons' point of view. Now, the show is extremely popular. I mean, the visual effects were amazing. I loved the costumes. The music was very subtle. Stu Phillips' soundtrack for the original Battlestar Galactica is still one of my favorites. Very orchestral, very loud, very vibrant. They went with a more subdued soundtrack for the TV show. Obviously, or for the reimagining, obviously the visual effects are much better because you now have CGI. You have a lot more dynamic shots. You're not as reliant on physical sets, practical sets, physical effects, that kind of thing. The big thing that, I watched most of Battlestar Galactica, but I found a lot of the characters not particularly likable. I couldn't relate to most of them. You had Commander Adama, played by James Olmos. You had Captain Apollo, Lee Adama, played by Jamie Bamber. Lieutenant Starbuck, Kara Thrace, played by Katie Sackhoff. And I think Michael Hogan played Colonel Ty. That's some of the main cast. There are a bunch of others in there. But there's a lot of hostility between some of the characters, and a lot of, interpersonal drama, especially, when you're talking about trying to save the human race. But I didn't like a lot of the characters. I didn't like some of the interactions. And one of the things that they always said at the beginning of the episode, the Cylons have returned and they've got a plan. And in the however many seasons that I watched that, I really didn't see much of an actual plan. It was more of a, we're going to make this up as we go along. and a lot of it didn't slot into place. The writing, I mean, there were some outstanding episodes. There were some episodes that I really enjoyed, but at the same time, I found a lot of them to be especially forgettable. Didn't really catch my interest, so to speak. But, you know, a lot of people did like it, especially those that were happy to have a more serious take on Battlestar Galactica as opposed to the more campy, family-friendly Battlestar Galactica from the 1970s. All right, we're going to swing around, see if we can get some good shots of the lake from this side. And I think I'm going to walk back. I mean, Battlestar Galactica got all kinds of accolades and awards, you know, especially for visual effects. Once they got the characters dialed in, you know, there was still going to be drama, but it wasn't necessarily the outright hostility that they had. And the biggest thing that I didn't like, and, you know, I felt this was sloppy writing, was they had like the final six Cylon, you know, there were a bunch of different models of Cylons, you know, whether it's the Trisha Health for one, or each model had a distinct actor for them, and then you also had the Cylon Raiders, and then you also had the Cylon Centurions. But there was this myth of the final six. I think it was the final six unknown models, and it was pretty much verboten to talk about them because, you know, the bizarre Cylon religion, for lack of a better term. Well, come to find out, these, you know, final five or final six, whatever the case was, were already on board the Galactica, and they didn't even know that they were Cylons, to be honest. It wasn't until the end of, I think, the second to last season that they all started hearing a version of All Along the Watchtower. Nobody else could hear it, and they all rallied into, you know, these remaining Cylons, for lack of a better term. Found out that they, you know, got all together and they started comparing notes, and then, you know, they realized that they were in fact, you know, they were Cylons. Nobody wanted to believe it because they've been fighting the Cylons for the last 3 or 4 years / seasons, and there was a lot of second guessing in there. I personally found that to be very sloppy writing because you're picking characters that had survived on the show, but what are the chances of those particular Cylon models surviving the nuclear strike? Why would they be on the Galactica? How would they have survived all of that? You know, what if Chief Tyrrell had been actually on board a different Battlestar and they, you know, died when it got nuked? You know, these are the things, you know, my suspension of disbelief was just I was unable to suspend my disbelief on that. I don't even think I finished the final season of Battlestar Galactica. When we got Peacock, mostly for, I think, Downton Abbey, they had Battlestar Galactica on it, and I honestly did try to sit down and watch the final season, and I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Again, the visuals were great. I liked some of the portrayals. You know, Katie Sackhoff's Kara Thrace Starbuck. I liked the character. I liked her attitude. You know, that was my first introduction to Katie Sackhoff. And, you know, she's since moved on to a lot of other things, whether it's The Mandalorian, whether she, you know, her role in Longmire. Excellent show. If you haven't seen Longmire, check it out. But I just couldn't get into the story, and everyone keeps raving about it and talking about how great the story is and how realistic and all, and it wasn't for me. I mean, obviously there was an audience. I just wasn't it. If it ever comes back to Peacock, I will probably struggle through the final season, probably with a lot of fast forwards, but, you know, just not my show. My wife and I, we watched it fairly religiously because at that point, you know, sci-fi was, science fiction, at least on television, you know, was starting to make the major push. I mean, you had Firefly, Serenity, and a few other shows, you know, Farscape, but it isn't the wealth of entertainment that we have today. But, if you like Battlestar Galactica and like the new show, I'm glad, just not my bag. But the original Battlestar Galactica helped influence a lot of me because a lot of my early development, again, completely unrealistic, but I still love the launching of the fighters. I love the space dog fights, the sound effects, all of that. And the music, Stu Phillips's score is still one of my favorites of any show or movie. And it also did influence future Glenn A. Larson productions like Buck Rogers in the 25th century, starring Gil Gerard. And the fighters in Buck Rogers were some of the original concept designs that they were going to use in Battlestar Galactica, but switched over to the more iconic classic Colonial Viper. And Buck Rogers had a lot of very similar items, similar feel to Battlestar Galactica, from the launching of fighters to the visual effects, same kind of style. They probably did have the same guys that did it for the original Battlestar Galactica do it. Again, it had a very orchestral soundtrack. Ignoring the movie that they had made, where they had Aaron Gray basically do a Bond theme introduction. Granted, I enjoyed that as a kid because Aaron Gray was exceptionally attractive. Yeah, she still is. But that was obviously the eye candy for all of the geeks and nerds. But the music for Battlestar Galactica, I laughed my ass off. I didn't understand it fully at the time, but in the movie Airplane 2, the sequel, a lot of the music was, some of the music was recycled from Battlestar Galactica, the epic cues, especially, when the shuttle launched and some of the other things. So I personally found that humorous, and you could probably find it in other things. The original Cylons, they had a red eye that swiveled back and forth, flashed back and forth with a distinctive sound. And if you watched Knight Rider, which I did because, I was a child of the 80s, it was an action show, and, fast cars, David Hasselhoff, before I even knew who he was, and Kit, the car, the second star of the show, also had a light that flashed back and forth on the front of the hood, similar to that of a Cylon, with a very similar sound. But then again, that was also a Glenn Larson production. No surprise there. Battlestar Galactica is a show that I periodically will watch when it's on TV, depending upon the episode. And, I might MST3K it, but at the same time, it is a part of my childhood, and I enjoyed it. If you haven't seen it, or you haven't seen the Ronald D. Moore remake, at least watch the pilot episodes. They're night and day. They share the name, they share the names of characters, and they share a basic setup, but they're two distinctly different shows. And one of the things that I did like about the reimagined, the remake, whatever, was the names of the characters from the original show: Starbuck, Apollo, Boomer. Those became call signs for the various characters. William Adama, his call sign I think was Husker, but he's long since stopped flying a fighter. But his son, Apollo, that was his call sign, Lee Adama, was Apollo. Kareth Race was Starbuck, and there's different ones in there as well. And I started to recognize some of the actors from the shows in other things that they had shown up in. And it's it was a launching pad for quite a few of them. I know I had seen Jamie Bamber before because he had been in Band of Brothers. I just don't remember him as Jamie Bamber because he played a lieutenant or something in like an episode or two. He wasn't one of the main characters. But Katie Sackhoff, that was the first thing I saw her in. And then every time I saw her in another show, like we started watching Longmire, again, great show, watch it. I really liked it. Her portrayal was great in that. She is in the Star Wars franchise, as she played a Mandalorian character both in the Clone Wars. I think she also did it in Rebels, and then obviously in the live-action version of The Mandalorian, where she plays just, the same character. All right, we got noise again, so I'm going to pause, and then we'll edit when I get across the road. All right, so one of the things that the original Battlestar Galactica did try and do was create its own mythology. The leader of the Cylon Empire was a creature, a being, a something or other called Imperious Leader, voiced by Patrick Macnee. Very distinctive voice. You never actually see him, you just hear him. Dick Durock played the physical manifestation of the character, who sat up on a large pedestal, looked like a giant reptilian. You really only saw him in the dark. You didn't actually see him. So, sorry about that, guys. Well, as the original series progressed, the Galactica finds a signal or a crashed something or other, and they travel to this planet, and they find the lone survivor of a ship, somebody that calls himself Count Iblis, or was it Iblis? Iblis, I believe. And they take him back, and he's a very charismatic figure, quickly swaying the council and the people he runs into, that he is the best leader for the fleet. He makes several promises, including to help feed everyone, and one of the other ones was to deliver the Count Baltar. Baltar was originally supposed to have been executed in the pilot, but they wanted a recurring villain, so instead of having him being executed by a Cylon Centurion, they flash back to that, and the Imperious Leader halts the execution, instead giving Baltar command of a task force trying to find the Galactica. He's a thorn in the side, throughout the show, and what Count Iblis says is, he will deliver Baltar to the fleet. Well, during this time, a bunch of weird lights start appearing, and nobody knows where they come from, nobody knows where they're going. Several colonial vipers vanish. As these ships, or these orbs of light, pass the agriculture ship, all of a sudden food starts, growing faster, whatever the case is, and, Count Iblis, takes credit for that. These orbs flash, go ahead and do flybys of the Cylon fleet that is attempting to find the Galactica. And Gaius Baltar, realizing that there's something new afoot, gets in a ship and, like a dumbass, goes to the Galactica, only to be arrested. And sure enough, Count Iblis takes credit for that as well, because, one of the greatest enemies of the colonies effectively turns himself in. Now, as Baltar and Iblis are having a conversation, Baltar has this very big revelation. He recognizes the voice. Count Iblis' voice is the same as that of the Imperious Leader. And they have a conversation. Nobody believes him because, he's a traitor. Effectively it comes down to, there should be no way for him to be the voice of the Imperious Leader, since, the Imperious Leader has been cloned or whatever over 1,000 years. That would have to make, Count Iblis 1,000 years old, and he just smiles at Baltar and lets him draw his own conclusions. Well, Count Iblis is, I don't know about the metaphorical, possible literal interpretation of, Satan, because when they return, Adama doesn't trust him, and thereby Apollo doesn't trust him. So Apollo and, his friends return to the planet, and they go inside. It's never shown on screen, but they hint that the dead people inside, have, cloven hooves and red skin, that kind of thing, indicating that they were devils. And when Iblis appears on the planet, he strikes somebody down, and Sheba or Apollo, somebody shoots him, and there's a flash of his form changing from that of Patrick McNee to some evil demon, devil, whatever the case you want to state. And as a kid, that was absolutely terrifying to me, because I didn't understand a lot of that. My imagination went wild. I still think it's a very good sequence, and you could probably find it on YouTube. Well, the ships of light, or the orbs of light, turn out to be ships of light, effectively angels, battling Count Iblis and such. Since the person that Iblis killed hadn't actually gone over to his side, I think it was either Apollo or Starbuck, they're able to revive the character. Since he was killed outside of the war, they were able to do that, and that was one of the story arcs that they were kind of starting to push forward with the ships of light potentially guiding the fleet, ever closer towards Earth. One of the interesting things was, while any of the characters were on the ships of light, usually their costumes, their uniforms, whatever, were tans and browns, very cyberpunk, steampunkish. But when they're on, the ships, they're pure white, stark white. I just found that interesting. But that was one of the mythological aspects, and then thinking about, how Count Iblis probably, well, I think it was actually stated at some point, he went back when he was, 1,000 years ago, he was working with Cylons. They were originally reptilian, organic, however the way you want to do it, but he slowly talked them into creating cybernetic warriors, transplanting their brains into them, because at least in the novelization, there were two distinct Centurions. You had your Silver Centurion and you had a Gold Centurion. And each one, when they talked about it, the Gold Centurion basically was a single-brain Centurion. But then you had the Gold Centurion that, had two brains. So they weren't, at least in the novels, and they were probably trying to do this in the show, they just couldn't adequately convey this. They weren't straight-up robots, but actually cyborgs. At any rate, Iblis guided them into the destruction of the organic species and the evolution of the new Cylon species. And in the reimagined Battlestar Galactica, I don't remember a lot of the details, but they did consider some of the final 5, the final 6 as to be, angels. And one of the interesting aspects that I did like about that show was, since the Cylons were all software based, they were all replicas of things, not organically, born or whatever. They had a resurrection ship, and as long as the Cylon was within range and wasn't blocked, if that particular model was killed, their consciousness would be transferred to a new body. And that had the effect of, that Cylon knowing what killed it, all the knowledge. There was one of the, I think, the better arcs was a Cylon called Scar, and it was Cylon Raider, but it had been killed several times, reborn, re-imaged into a new machine, and it just got nastier and nastier. And that was one of the things that the colonials figured out, was that every time they killed somebody, they kept coming back. Any secrets that, they had learned, the old adage, dead men tell no tales, didn't work here, because, as long as they could upload to the resurrection ship, dead people could tell tales. So there was an episode that actually had to track down a resurrection ship and destroy it to prevent that from happening. And eventually there was a civil war between the Cylons over, the final 5, over the way the war was waged, everything. And one side lured the other side into a trap. It's what can you say? You can't. I don't make the news, I just report it. And ultimately destroyed, that particular section's Cylon's, resurrection ship, so that, when they finally did die, they wouldn't be coming back for more. I did find that very interesting and a neat way to allow characters to be killed but keep coming back. And yeah, I don't remember a whole lot from like I said, from the reimagined. I do remember some of the stories. I think one of my favorites was where they had to go and raid a Tillium mine, not Tylium. I think it was the same spelling, they just changed it, for fuel for the fleet. It was a pretty badass space battle. And in general, the space battles were, exceptionally well done. The Vipers did have, maneuvering thrusters on them to allow them to roll and bank left, right, that kind of thing. The question whether or not they would have enough power to do that and enough fuel to do that and bank the way that they did and not turn the pilots into, grease stains on their cockpits, that's a different story, but is still, very badass visuals. I will probably try and watch it again just to try and be a completionist, because I did put in 3 or 4 or whatever up to the last season. It's just I totally lost interest, and when I did try and watch it again, it just didn't jive with me. It wasn't like, oh yeah, 20 years later, let's pick this up again. No, still don't like it. No sir, I don't like it. But, Battlestar Galactica was one of the many shows and movies that came out in the aftermath of Star Wars. Battle Beyond the Stars. Roger Corman's, one of Roger Corman's takes on it. Basically you've got the Magnificent Seven set in space. You got the big-breasted ship Nell, and if you ever look at Battle Beyond the Stars, just look at the poster, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've never seen the movie. But it had George Peppard in it, Robert Vaughn, who actually did star in the Magnificent Seven as well, and I think he played effectively the same character. But branching off from Battlestar Galactica into Star Wars spin-offs, Battle Beyond the Stars was Magnificent Seven in space. A evil empire has been going around, wiping things out. So one character, I think Henry Thomas was the actor. Forgive me, it's been a very long time since I've seen it. Effectively, he gets control of the ship Nell, and he recruits a bunch of other warriors to help fight against, the enemy. And say what you will about the movie, again, the characters are at least somewhat visually interesting. They're all distinct. The ships I thought looked really cool, and Roger Corman is the master of low-budget movies. James Cameron, learned at the foot of the master in that regard, which is why he was able to make the original Terminator on such, for lack of a better term, a shoestring budget, because he learned how to do, night shoots. He learned how to get in, get the shot, get out. Simple things to, make the visual effects shots. Forced perspective is a big one, so that you can give the illusion that something's massive when in fact it is, a little 6-inch model on a shooting stage or whatever. Oh, but what else? The sounds of Battlestar Galactica also, resonate with me, whether it's the launching of the Vipers, that sound of their thrusters being fired. When I played Wing Commander, one of the things that Wing Commander had was the afterburner to, give you massive acceleration. And for me, that was always, hitting the turbos from Battlestar Galactica. The sound effects of the lasers carried over a lot as well. There was an expansion in the Old Republic where you got this blaster rifle, blaster pistol, whatever the case was, and when you fired it, it had that distinctive Battlestar Galactica laser sound, and it might not have been the best weapon out there, but audially speaking, still love it. The costumes, obviously, 70s, same with the hair. I mean, you look at, as soon as they take off their helmets, You can tell it's the 70s based upon that, somewhat shag look for most of the male actors. The women were obviously, had that 70s haircut. And, again, it influenced me. I really do like that. It's one of the reasons I like that 70s show. I didn't necessarily grow up in the 70s, but I was 70s adjacent, so I could appreciate a lot of that. But, yeah. The costumes, as I said, the modern Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined, their flight suits actually look like something you would see on like an aircraft carrier or in an Air Force base or something as they're fixing to get in there for pressurization. The helmets were sealed because, you're in space. If there's a crack in your cockpit, well, you're stuck in vacuum. The helmets on the original Battlestar Galactica had a very Egyptian-esque look, kind of like a pharaoh's hood, kind of cobra looking. They had LEDs around, at the top and around their mouths, but the helmet was open. Again, if you're landing on a planet with bad, questionable atmosphere, you don't have gloves, you don't have ceiling uniform, your helmet's exposed, we're all gonna die. But, again, that was, same with Star Wars. Star Wars, they didn't have full-faced helmets either. They had, George Lucas wanted to effectively make, World War II dogfights, but put them in space. They didn't have covered helmets. They didn't have real flight suits that would protect against vacuum. And I mean, even if they did eject, as they tried to tell Porkins, go ahead and eject, what the hell are they going to do? Even, he's going to crash land onto the Death Star, and if they're successful, he's going to die. And, if they don't destroy the Death Star, he's still going to die when they find his ejected, cockpit or whatever it was, because that was something I never understood. Because they were sure it was a sealed cockpit, but it didn't look like a module that could be ejected from the X-Wing. We never saw an ejection, so, we don't know. I know that in the game X-Wing, love that game, harkening back to my childhood, getting that hit of nostalgia dopamine, you did have the ability to eject and be rescued, or sometimes eject and be captured. They didn't exactly show, the cockpit module or whatever, but, still, you had the chance to, redo the mission. Or you get captured and you have to load a save file or hack the save file so that you can keep progressing. While I do love the game X-Wing, there were a few missions that were just a pain in my ass. And once I got past one, I usually found like a save game editor so that I could, not have to go back and redo that one. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, Wing Commander. Launching from, one of the various carriers or a base, firing the afterburners. That always reminded me of, Battlestar Galactica. Loved it. Buck Rogers had the same kind of launch sequences, same kind of sound effects, same kind of everything. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I have a feeling that's at least for the first season why, Buck Rogers was so popular, because it tapped into that Battlestar Galactica nostalgia. Granted it was just a few years before, but you had that action, that space sequences, ships flying around. Yeah, and again, Aaron Gray didn't hurt at all. Alright, well, I'm going to actually have to go in and edit some of this since there was a few breaks and I think I hit the wrong button. And I have to throw a second part into this so I get to learn about transitions. But what did you think of Battlestar Galactica? Did you watch the original? Did you like it? How about the reimagining? There's news that they're going to be doing a continuation movie / TV show. It's kind of on hold with the writers or with the actors strike. I'm curious about that. I still kind of would like to finish the original, the reimagined show, at least see the final few episodes to find out how it ended. I've seen some spoilers, not that I remember them particularly, but we'll see. At any rate, thank you for watching this longer ramble. Like and subscribe. Leave me some comments below, and if there's a topic that you would like me to talk about, go ahead and post it, and I'll see what I can do. Have a great day.